Welcome to The People's View, a program dedicated to discussing local, state, and national issues and their effect on the American people. The People's View provides a platform for state representatives and national figures to present their viewpoint. Whether it's social, economic, or financial topics, you'll hear it on The People's View.
Welcome to The People's View. I'm your host, Carl Seidel. The People's View is sponsored by the Nashua Republican City Committee, and you can find out more about the activities of the committee by going to its website, nashuagop.org. We meet on the second Thursday of the month at the Crown Plaza Hotel Auditorium, and we'd like to see you there. Today we have the Business and Industry Association, and Jim Roche, the president, will introduce our other guests here, and we're going to talk about their strategic plan.
Right. Thanks, Carl.
Okay.
To my right is John Gilbert. John is a principal with Synchrony Advisors, and John played a key role in the development of the strategic economic plan. And to John's right is Steve Norton, who's the executive director of the Center for Public Policy Studies, and Steve and his crew at the center also played an integral role in the development of this plan. Carl?
Okay, and it took you a while to put it all together. It's a how many page plan?
It's about a 50-page plan, and it took us about a year to bring it all together. And it was actually in the works or building over the span of 7 years. We had a lot of members interested in having us do this, but we held off until just recently.
And people can find out the details on your website.
Right, BIA/strategic.
Okay.
Is where to get it.
And that'll be put on our tape so people at the end of the show so that people can use that as a reference if they want to get back to some of the details that we're going to be talking about.
Great.
Okay, so how do we want to start in telling us about the elements of it? How it all went together and how many people had a hand in it?
Sure. Well, let me back up and say that we do a pretty elaborate policy development process every year for distinct steps, 5 months long, and during that, it culminates in an annual public policy priorities document, which we sit down and share with the governor and legislative leaders from both parties. And we do this every year, and for 7 years in a row, our members were telling us, we're kind of concerned about the direction of the state. This was even pre-recession. And every year, our members come forward and say, you guys need to put together a strategic economic plan for New Hampshire because we're concerned about the direction of the state, who's sort of looking at the headwinds that we may be facing or that we are facing, who's capitalizing on opportunities, those sorts of things. And every year that recommendation came to my board in the fourth and final step in our policy development process, and they said, boy, it's a great idea, and somebody ought to do it. We'd like a seat at the table, but we're not going to do it. And I think the concern was that it would take us off what our members have come to expect of us, which is watching their back at the State House and the state regulators. And also we produce about 40, 50 programs throughout the year on substantive issues. And so our members have come to expect that. And I think the board felt that to take on a strategic economic plan would kind of pull us away from that. But a little over a year ago, Governor Lynch, who'd been serving 4 terms and had announced his retirement, and there was continued unease. Nobody else had stepped up in the preceding 7 years to take this project on, so the board just concluded, we need to do this. And to their credit, the board allowed me to hire a couple of great partners in John Gilbert and one of his colleagues, Cotton Cleveland, and Steve Norton to help us make it happen. And so we formed a board oversight committee. I have a 34-member board of directors, a very strong business board of directors, and about half the board served on a board oversight committee, which helped throughout the process, helped kind of guide and counsel us throughout the process. And we developed early on a vision statement, and the vision statement, Carl, is to ensure that New Hampshire provides meaningful advantages for businesses through a vibrant, sustainable economy and the best environment in which our residents can prosper. And so that was sort of the starting point. We formed a number of stakeholder groups around key issue areas, which I'd like John to elaborate on, if he would. And then as a part of that process, which John will speak to, we established goals, and Steve and his crew was instrumental in helping us articulate the goals based on some benchmark information that he provided. So John, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on the stakeholder group process.
Yeah. There were nine subject areas that are various elements that people, that we thought were important to the economy, like, energy, workforce housing, healthcare, education, those kinds of things. And for each of those, we established, what we called a stakeholder group, and each of those groups met 3 times. So there were 27 meetings, essentially. And I would say somewhere around 200 or maybe a little over 200 people participated, in those various groups. And the process basically started out with Steve's team providing some background documents in each of the areas so that the people coming into the first meeting would have a little bit of context for conversation. And we would talk about, we talked about those things, the background information. We tried to start articulating what we thought was a long-term goal, 5 to 15 years out. We would like this to be the condition with respect to energy and fiscal policy and so on. And then after that first meeting, the Cotton Cleveland and I, who were facilitating these stakeholder group meetings, would go back and actually put together a draft goal. The second meeting was used to sort of finalize that goal, but then to start talking about, if that's the goal, what kinds of things would we be doing to move the state in the direction of achieving that goal, and what would that look like? So we started talking about metrics again. Steve's team provided some draft metrics. He'll talk a lot more about that. And so we looked at metrics, and then we started saying, okay, if we wanted to move the needle on these metrics in a positive direction, what are the recommendations that we would make? So the second session focused on talking about metrics and beginning to talk about sort of the tactical recommendations we would make. And then the third session was focused on refining that further and sort of bringing that to conclusion. One of the groups that we called Business Growth, Retention, and Attraction was really designed to overcome the siloing effect. If you look at energy and you look at fiscal policy, and they obviously lap over into one another. And I think that that group was designed to sort of draw those pieces together and make sure we weren't missing something, by that approach. And so that group had sort of a staggered start. After the first 2 sets of meetings for the other 8 groups, then that group had its first meeting and then worked its way through. In between each of the sets of meetings, we would meet with the board oversight committee so that they would get a briefing on what we had talked about so far and what kinds of things we were seeing, and allowed them to stay very much engaged and very much in tune with what was going on in the stakeholder groups, which was going to be important as they started to get involved in reviewing the draft of the plan itself, because they would need that sort of background and context. And it was I thought that part was a very effective aspect of the process. Once that work was completed, then Cotton and I sat down and did an initial draft of the plan, sort of pulling all of these pieces together, as well as some of the dashboard work that the Public Policy Center was doing, and put that together. And then the Board Oversight Committee got involved in reviewing that document, and we went through a couple of iterations where we kind of tightened that up and then brought that to the full board at the end of October.
Sounds like you had a nice plan going, and elements were all what you needed to. I thought it was a very thorough process, and the thing that was very interesting to me was we had lots of different groups. We had businesses, certainly, but we also had people who were sort of policy experts that would show up in each of these areas. But everybody did a great job of really trying to think about what's best for business in New Hampshire, not sort of the narrow interests that they typically represent. And I thought that was something that was really interesting, and it was rewarding, I would say, to see as a part of that overall experience.
Okay. Carl, if I might, can I just identify the different goal areas, and then maybe Steve can comment on some of the benchmarking data that he provided. So as John indicated, there were 9 different, what we call stakeholder areas. They're kind of key elements of the economy and key areas that businesses are concerned about. And the first is business growth, retention, and attraction. So the stakeholder group in that area developed a goal for that area. Education, workforce skills, and labor pool was a second area that we focused on. Energy, fiscal policy, healthcare, infrastructure, telecommunications, roads and bridges, and sewer and water infrastructure. Natural, cultural, and historic resources was another stakeholder group. Regulatory environment, both labor regs and environmental regs, and workforce housing. And so, again, Steve and the Center for Public Policy Study were instrumental in helping us shape these goals, because you really can't establish a goal without knowing how you stack up today and where you might want to get to. So Steve, would you mind?
Sure.
Okay.
I think in a simple way you can think of what Jim and his board put together initially was an overarching goal for the state, and then they got together a bunch of people and said, how do we put meat on this overarching goal? And they came up with these 9 domains. And to use healthcare, or maybe better energy as an example, within that goal of having a diverse, high-quality, low-cost system, they asked us, how do you measure that? How might you assess this over time? And so we put together information on the cost of electricity for commercial and residents. We put together information on the diversity of energy, the share of our energy that comes from oil versus natural gas. We tried to put together information on the quality of the electrical infrastructure, because as you know, some advanced high-tech manufacturing organizations need a very high-quality energy system without interruption, because they're working on very fine pieces of manufacturing. So we put that data together to allow them to say, okay, we're doing better or worse in this particular goal relative to some competitor states. And we had to make some decisions about what those competitor states. For New Hampshire, manufacturing remains one of the largest, in fact, the largest source of compensation and gross domestic product. And where a lot of the competition is occurring in advanced high-tech manufacturing is in states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas. So we use those states as competitor states to compare ourselves and allow the Business and Industry Association and the work groups to assess those goals. We did that for each of the work groups. So we did it for healthcare, we did it for energy, we did it for regulation, we did it for workforce housing, we did it for education. And within that body of information, then the work groups said, okay, we're doing better or worse, and we need to develop some tactics around these particular issues. From our perspective as a research organization, a couple of trends emerged. Number one, we are currently a very highly educated state with a good labor force, but some of the indicators about our future labor force aren't quite as good. We're aging. We've got a high share of science and technology and math jobs in the state, but we've also got a very old workforce, if you'll excuse the phrase. So to some extent, while we rank very well in some of those indicators about our environment now, those that predict the future not quite as well. The second one is that we tend to be a very high input cost state. And so healthcare is expensive in New Hampshire, energy is expensive. And so we're at a competitive disadvantage in those areas. And then finally, like most states, we rank relatively poorly with respect to infrastructure and some of the investments that we have to make. So I think all those things informed the strategic planning process and the work group, and I think ultimately the board then, I think, spent a lot of time thinking through all of this information and came up with the tactics.
Yeah, so Carl, we have over 100 recommendations, 10, 11, 12 per section, the 9 different kind of strategic areas of the plan.
Look at the one on the top, the first one. Can you get into a little detail on that?
Well, so the first,
is that
let me
the way
read.
you want to go?
No, that's what, so the goal under business growth, retention, and attraction reads, New Hampshire offers the best environment for innovation and entrepreneurship in the Northeast United States, consistently growing, creating, and drawing in successful business and the people that create and lead them. So that's sort of the what I would call the economic development goal, and as John indicated, that was the stakeholder group that sort of tried to draw in elements from all the other issue areas. And so a number of recommendations came out of that. One is, as Steve indicated, advanced manufacturing, high tech drives much of New Hampshire's economy by virtue of gross state product and wages and a number of people working in that sector, exports. So really a lot of activity generated around that sector of the economy. I would call it the first among equals, equal sectors in New Hampshire. And so if you want to hang on to that and help it grow and prosper, you want to encourage research and development. It leads to prototyping and high margin manufacturing. And so the BIA several years ago led the charge to get an R&D tax credit, state tax credit, reestablished in New Hampshire, and we were successful last session doubling it, but it's still very modest. it's only a $2 million pool from which businesses draw, and while they're eligible to take up to a $50,000 tax credit. And again, you want to encourage them to do basic R&D because it leads to more things on the manufacturing continuum. The average payout over the last couple of years is about $13,000, $14,000 per manufacturer. So while the legislature, to its credit, doubled that, it's still very modest, and it's still cumbersome. You have to apply for it. You don't get it until after the fact, and then it's prorated out depending on the number of requests. So we'll be working, not this coming session, not the 2014 session, but leading up to the 2015 session. One of the recommendations that we'll be pursuing is trying to maybe eliminate the cap or certainly raise it, and then somehow getting rid of the sort of after the fact application process that one has to go through. So a number of other recommendations in that area. John and Steve, feel free to jump in if you recall some of them.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that was very evident to the business growth, retention, and attraction group was just that the high tech and the advanced manufacturing was a place where we actually had an advantage, a competitive advantage against some of the other states that are doing the same things, even with the issues about the costs of healthcare and energy and so on. And so the group recognized that was really critical. And one of the things that kept coming up over and over again in almost every group that I was involved with in some fashion or another, workforce was at the core of the concerns of the people that are running those kinds of businesses. They need to have people that are well trained. They need them to be living in places that are close by where they work, so that they can retain that workforce and build it. And we had some anecdotal stories about some good paying jobs that the companies were not able to fill because the people that they wanted to bring into the workforce couldn't find affordable housing, as an example, in the area. So that was a way in which we started to see that sort of integration of these various factors and the interrelationships. And I think that was, so a lot of what that group did was they tried to avoid reinventing the wheel, to the degree that things had already been recommended about workforce housing. They didn't want to do that again, but they were looking for those things that would sort of support that area in the longer term.
Did you interact with the legislators at all while you were developing this? Or are you planning on, now that you have the plan, to talk with them? Remember they had a business coalition there that
Right.
I was on? And,
We did not. We deliberately did not,
Okay.
because at the end of the day, it's policymakers who we want to talk to about implementing sections of the plan. And so, if you have policymakers in on the development of the plan, that might not be a good thing. We wanted them to be the target of elements of the plan. And so in the coming year, 2014, what the BIA will do is try to move the ball forward on, say, a dozen or so of these recommendations. As I indicated, there are over 100 in the 9 different sections of the plan. We want to take responsibility for some key ones, but we're hoping other groups, other trade associations, legislators, perhaps the governor, trade associations will see elements in different parts of the strategic economic plan for New Hampshire that they find important, and they'll carry the ball forward themselves.
Kind of get some of the legislators who are on that business orientation group back in the legislature.
It's one interesting thing. We put together a dashboard, in essence, that you can find on our website, and serves as one part of the report that the BIA produced. And we've seen some interest in the legislature. John Saprowski has put in a plan for an economic development plan. The new commissioner of DRED, Jeff Rose.
Yeah, I'm interviewing him next week.
Great. Obviously critically important to this process, and people are starting to pick up on the information.
Yeah.
I mean, you can think of that dashboard in some respects as a way of measuring the New Hampshire advantage and its comparative advantage to some of these other places across the country when you're competing for human capital, financial capital, as well as jobs. And so depending on the industry, you might want to look at different indicators or different measures, but I think it will get traction over the next 18 months, in part because of the BIA's work, but also in part because there's a general unease, as Jim said, about where New Hampshire stands and where it's headed relative to the global economy.
Definitely. But I think there's a lot of people that are interested in helping out along these lines. And I know when I was there, the plan for some of these things, like R&D tax credit, loss carry forward, some of the elements that we started with was to phase it in so it gets to be more realistic.
Right.
I mean, it was just, it was hard enough to get the first step in, but now we've got the door open and maybe you can get a little bit more.
Right. I would argue that New Hampshire is at a crossroads. People define the New Hampshire advantage in different ways. Clearly, a couple of elements I think on most people's lists would be the lack of an income tax or a sales tax. But as we've talked about, we have a very high business profits tax, 8.5%. We have this unique business enterprise tax. Some people consider that a backdoor tax that businesses are paying for their employees, backdoor income tax. We have high energy costs, high healthcare costs. We have a regulatory climate that our members, my BI members, are telling us is onerous in many cases, and perhaps even worse in some of our neighboring states and certainly some of the competing states. So, unless we address these issue areas, these challenges, New Hampshire runs the risk of becoming just another, what many consider to be anti-business Northeast U.S. state. The New Yorks and the, Massachusetts, some people call it Taxachusetts, and Maine and Vermont. We want to try and avoid that, and I think that if we can make incremental progress, as you just noted, but not just in the tax area, but energy policy and healthcare and infrastructure issues, incremental progress, I think New Hampshire will stand out as the best place, perhaps not the best in the country or the world, but certainly the best place in the Northeast for businesses and a healthy, vibrant economy, and a great place for our residents to
Well, I
work.
think that the vibrant economy is the way that at least a number of us are trying to say that's the way you're going to get better income to pay for some of this stuff.
Yeah.
You get the economy to raise, and everybody contributes a little bit more. And then you have more to improve the elements that need improvement.
Right. So picking up on the recommendations, some of the recommendations are very specific. The R&D tax credit is a good example of them, and some of them are a little bit broader. For example, there were some recommendations in the healthcare area that talk about the need for a healthy population and a healthy workforce, and that fact alone led us about 3 weeks ago to come out in support of Medicaid expansion, which we would have never done had we not approved this plan. Because the plan, I think, once the board adopted it, allowed us to think more broadly than some of the kind of bread and, or maybe a better way to say it is the kind of cost to the business community, direct cost that we've been analyzing things, the lens through which we've analyzed things in the past. So for example, Medicaid, we've always looked at cost shifting. When the state underfunds the Medicaid program, those costs get shifted through and the business community ends up picking up that some of that shortfall through higher health insurance premiums. So the Medicaid expansion issue, as an example, had we not approved this plan, that's the only lens through which we would have looked at the issue, and we probably would have stayed out of the whole debate because information suggests that it's kind of a wash. If you expand, not much happens with cost shifting. If you don't expand, roughly the same outcome. And so, but the board felt, given the approval of this plan, that insuring more people, getting more people insured would be a good thing. A healthy workplace results in a healthy population results in higher productivity and better outcomes. And so the board looked beyond just the cost issue and ended up supporting Medicaid expansion, which was not approved ultimately, but we had some caveats associated with that. But again, I think the strategic economic plan that my board of directors signed off on will give the BIA a little broader focus than we've had up to now. We're still very, very pro-business. One of the specific recommendations, for example, is we think New Hampshire should be a right-to-work state. There are a lot of folks that wonder about that, but we think that's the right way to go. So some of these recommendations are very specific and absolutely pro-business. Others will allow us to take a broader view than we have up to now.
Think about the way New Hampshire is perceived from a labor perspective. It's not only a low tax place to live, but it's also 1 hour from Boston, 1 hour from the ocean, 1 hour from the mountains. And that can be important for location decisions for business as well, not just prices. And obviously we fare well in quality of life measures, less so in some of the other indicators, including some of the fiscal indicators, which we have a fairly high corporate tax rate, which creates some barriers to individuals coming in. I think the interesting question going forward from a public policy perspective is where are you going to get the highest return for the state? If you're going to invest money, we don't have a lot of extra money. We're coming out of a recession. There's some indication that revenues are coming back, but where do you make that? Do you make it in an R&D tax credit or something else? I think those are difficult decisions that the legislature is going to have to grapple with coming up.
You have a recommendation along any of those lines?
I think we're going to have to look at those. I think the BIA is a great starting point. They put a bunch of tactics on the table that we're going to have to collectively take a very close look
Sort
at.
of prioritize
Yep.
some of those
Exactly.
elements?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. What, in general, do you have anything that is highest priority or decided on yet, or is it just really still being discussed?
Well, from the work that the Business Growth Retention and Attraction Group did, I think that the human capital question is a major one. Steve had mentioned earlier that we have a highly educated population, but they're starting to age out, and the cohort isn't filling in behind them with that same set of skills. And I think historically, I don't know why I'm talking about the stuff that you bring to the table, but historically our advantage in that area has been that there's been a lot of in-migration of those highly educated people. Well, now we're not seeing that anymore. In fact, we're starting to see out-migration in that same group. And that is an area that I think is going to be challenging, because we're competing with other areas around the country where it's also attractive to live, and these kinds of exciting businesses are being founded. That group felt that it was very important for us to create an environment where people want to come to work because it's innovative and it's challenging and there's exciting things going on. And we recognize that some of the costs of doing business are not as good as we might like them to be, and that at some point, a business might reach a scale where it has to move somewhere else just for economic reasons. But if it does, we want to keep those people that started it here, so that they start the next one and the one after that and the one after that, and they create these incubators that other people want to be a part of. And I think that's one of the key considerations that group was thinking about, is human capital.
Are you, I guess, is there anything in the state that sort of sells the state other than the department, DRED, or any of the businesses actively trying to entice companies come in?
DRED obviously does that. I'm not sure if businesses themselves do it.
But no,
Chambers of Commerce?
Chambers of Commerce,
public
obviously.
service.
Yep.
PSNH has at least they used to have a business attraction component to what they do, and they were very supportive and partnered frequently with DRED on doing business attraction. But I would point out that business retention is more important than attraction. If you have growing successful companies in New Hampshire,
that's probably the best place to start.
Exactly,
because they're already here.
Right. Anybody in business knows it's easier to keep a customer than it is to go out and get a new one. It's
Right.
less expensive. It's an easier proposition. So you want to hang on to what you have. And as we've discussed, we have a very robust advanced manufacturing high-tech sector. Let's hang on to those companies and let's help them do what they need to do to grow and add new jobs. Bringing in companies from the outside is sexy and it's exciting.
Well, I
That's
noticed
not
a
the bread
couple
and
new
butter.
companies have been coming. I was just kind of curious whether that effort was coordinated. But let's talk about retention. What is the highest element that you need to improve on to retain companies? Is it the education system? Is it the training, retraining of people somehow into new skills?
I think it's a variety of things.
Yeah. I mean, one absolute pipeline necessity is an educated workforce to do what we think of as blue-collar jobs, but really aren't anymore. They're all high-tech, computer-based, highly skilled manufacturing jobs. And if you talk to people like Hampshire Ball Bearing, they're really interested in a K through 12 system that produces highly educated, skilled people who are going to step right off into a manufacturing site, be able to manage computers and some production. That's one part of it. But then there's also another part, which is master's levels individuals. And communities are solving that in different ways. Some are seeking employees from other schools in other states. Some, like Hypotherm in the North Country, is building their own education institute within the walls of their organization that trains those people to do those high advanced tech manufacturing tasks. So we heard, I think, that again and again, both in the data and then in the reflection on that data, that communities are going to have to create those pipelines. And that's critically important.
Is there any organized effort? I know when I was in the legislature, we did the capital improvements for the community colleges. And several of the community colleges really had good plans. In fact, I think they put the University of New Hampshire to shame with some of the plans they had for some of the tech that they were teaching. And is that expanding in any way? I mean, I think there was only 3 that really were involved.
Yeah, I would say it's expanding a great deal. The movement of Albany to Rochester was in part a function of the Community Technical Institute having some capacity to train people. Hypotherm has worked with the local community college to build out that education institute, and I know Ross Cattell, who's the new chancellor at the community colleges, is really pushing this as a critical role for the community technical or community college system. The UNH is also trying to seek and expand its capacity by partnering with individual businesses, really. And Terrasis, I think, is one example that they've done. But they've got an initiative called UNH Innovate, which is trying to replicate some of the things that communities need.
Carl, I'm going to toot our horn a little bit here, because the BIA and in partnership with the Center for Public Policy Studies has really worked hard to highlight the importance of a sector that has long led New Hampshire's economy, again, advanced manufacturing, high tech. I would say 3 years ago, if you sat down with 100 legislators and asked them what the primary economic driver in New Hampshire was, they would say tourism or healthcare services or business services. And the reality then, just as it is today, is no, it's not. Those are important sectors, absolutely. But advanced manufacturing, high tech drives New Hampshire's economy. And so we underwrote a study that the Center for Public Policy Studies did about 2.5 years ago called Smart Manufacturing, High Tech, New Hampshire's leading economic sector. And it highlighted just what we're talking about, the importance of that sector by virtually any economic measure. And then other segments of that plan looked at the cost of doing business in New Hampshire. And getting back to your question about, what do we need to do to hang on to these great companies? It's not just access to a science, technology, engineering, math educated workforce and workplace-ready young people that don't expect to be president after being on the job for a year or two getting out of college. But it's also focusing on things like the high business profits tax. In fact, one of the recommendations in this plan is to lower business taxes when economically appropriate. But we have very high energy costs. We're at the end of the energy pipeline, very expensive for manufacturers that use a lot of energy to compete when they're paying as high a rate for electrical energy as they do now. Healthcare costs are some of the highest in the country. Businesses really struggle to try and do the right thing by providing healthcare for their employees. So that's another area that we need to work on. But again, advanced manufacturing, high tech, drives much of New Hampshire's economy. All sectors of the economy are absolutely important, but much of the rest of the economy relies on a successful advanced manufacturing, high-tech piece of the economy. So all of the things that they struggle with, access to this well-educated workforce and the business profits tax, many of these companies are competing globally. So they don't have to be here in the first place, and they sure as heck don't have to grow here. So that's really the future, unless we address these kind of issue areas, these challenges facing businesses, and make some incremental progress. We don't have to hit a home run every time, but if we make some incremental progress across the board, I think New Hampshire would be really, really well served in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
You were comparing New Hampshire to other states, and you mentioned North Carolina and Texas as 2 of them. It's interesting because I was involved with a startup company in Texas in the 90s, and Texas was trying to grow real well, but every city was competing with each city. And we went to North Carolina to find out why they were so successful in their plan. And the central story was that they got everybody together and said, look, we're going to settle on getting one center, but as that center grows, we're going to make sure that the supply companies, for you people or new companies, are going to locate. Everybody's going to get a piece of the action. And I think they followed that. I was wondering whether any of those elements is something that would be to look at here in New Hampshire.
I think that's a great point. One of the struggles in the groups was the tension between a statewide organization like the BIA and local economies. And Nashua is a very different economy than Manchester, than Portsmouth, than Concord, than the North Country. And so there is this statewide component, which is how do you make a fertile ground? And then I think the next question that's going to have to be answered by chambers and regional planning groups and others is how do you create out of this environment and take advantage of the assets of each individual community? BIE is obviously a central post in the economy of the Nashua area. What is it that is going to create the most fertile environment here? And is it a lower regulatory environment than Massachusetts, which draws businesses over the border or keeps businesses here? Portsmouth might have a different set of answers or different questions that they're raising. So that's, I think you're exactly right, that North Carolina demonstrated that there's a local ecology to all these economic decisions that we're going to have to think about as communities.
Until relatively recently, the Chamber of Commerce and the city administration weren't really talking together.
Yep.
Now they are,
Yep.
but that's what I think we need to have.
I think that concept, you mentioned it in passing, and that was what I was going to contribute, is that concept of an economic ecology is something that's really important, because it isn't just sort of business by business, but it's how the businesses interact with one another and how these other factors come to bear.
Yeah.
And so we have to really start thinking more broadly about things as, from a holistic perspective of how do we put these conditions together and marry up, the suppliers to the BAEs and the suppliers to the suppliers, and, how do we create that sort of environment in the most constructive way that we can.
So where do you go from here now?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier, what we will be doing, the BIA, is taking about a dozen of these recommendations, again, over 100 recommendations. So we're trying to lift one or two from each of the 9 sections. And I'll be pitching those to my board at our January meeting, and I assume they'll sign off on all or most of the recommendations that I'll be making about what we should do in 2014. In the meantime, we did a very public launch of this strategic economic plan just a little while ago that Steve and John were involved with, and we're going to continue to do that. So, for example, earlier this week, I met with the board of the High Tech Council. Last week, met with the Manchester Chamber. Met with the insurance agents of New Hampshire this week. So we're getting out in front of groups all over the state, Rotary clubs and chambers and trade associations, and making the presentation about the plan, sharing the recommendations, and as I said earlier, we hope that these groups and some individuals and businesses and legislators, we hope the governor and some of the 424 legislators in New Hampshire will see elements of this strategic economic plan and say, I like that. I'm going to translate that into a piece of legislation that will improve some aspect of the environment for businesses to succeed. And so that's what we're doing. We'll take some of these on, take responsibility ourselves, the BIA, and we're encouraging others to do the same.
So this is all on your website. Is that something that has all the information, all these recommendations, and would you solicit input from people who
Sure,
might read it?
absolutely, yeah. Again, the plan is at biaofnh.com/strategic. The entire plan is there, all 50 or so pages, all the 9 issue areas and the over 100 recommendations, the background, all of it is there. So yeah, we absolutely would welcome feedback and participation and support.
Okay, well, I think this is an excellent start on something that was very much needed. I could see, hopefully, Jeff Rose, I think, I've known him for a while, and I think he's probably a good person to put in that, but they have a very small budget, unfortunately.
Right.
And I'm not sure what the state can do actively. I think you're going to have to get everybody pushing them in that direction.
Right. There is some reference in the plan about aligning, trying to get DRED in the state aligned with some of the issues that we've identified in this strategic economic plan. And we have a very good relationship with Jeff in the department, so look forward to working cooperatively with Jeff.
And let's say you're invited back when you want to have something to use this forum to try to promote your effort, because I think it's a very worthwhile and needed effort for the state. So thank you very much for coming in and talking with us, and good luck.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, guys.